Go.
All right, so here we are again on the tip of the Battery, and behind me is Brooklyn. Now I brought you over here to talk a little bit about Brooklyn's place in the Revolutionary War. Later on, we're going to see where George Washington was inaugurated as our first president. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what made him so popular and loved prior to getting elected as our first president. Now, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. However, the colonists had been fighting a year before that. So the new country, I should say, was enthralled in a war. George Washington had just beat the British up in Boston, and he knew that his next step in controlling the war was to take hold of New York City. Controlling the Hudson was vital, as the British wanted it so they could control all the way up to Canada and basically split the young colonies into two. And they thought that was their way of winning. So George Washington made sure after Boston to come down here, and he knew that just how he had sieged Boston with placing his troops on the top of the hill, he could do the same thing in Brooklyn. If you see behind me, you can at the time there were a few Dutch houses and maybe a church or two. Now, of course, Brooklyn's massive. I believe if it were its own country, if it were its own city in the United States, it would be the third largest city, just the borough of Brooklyn. So as you can see past those shipping cranes, there are a bunch of hills. That was George Washington's plan, to set his troops up on top of the hill and put a line of defense at the bottom. Well, he waited, and he waited 3 months. Finally, the British started to bring their ships in. They landed on Staten Island. The bay looked like a forest full of ships. We're talking 13,000 young ragtag troops against the 34,000 in the British Army, the most powerful army in the world. And even still, George Washington waited for their attack. He waited weeks. Now, I might mention that the day they landed in Staten Island also happened to be the exact same day that they signed the Declaration of Independence. We all know what day that is, right? Wrong. It's actually July 2nd. July 4th is the day they announced it to the public. So once again, George Washington and his troops are waiting, and they're waiting for weeks. Finally, they get word from New Jersey that the British have started to move. They take their ships around Long Island and start up. Now, a local loyalist gave them a secret passage. They were able to take the first line of defense of George Washington's army. George Washington saw a choice. He could either stay and fight for New York, or he could save his troops. And he chose the latter. He knew that saving those men was going to lose him New York and possibly the war, but he chose to save his men. So late at night, one night, they planned their escape. No one was allowed to talk. They pushed their wagons as quietly as possible down to Fulton Ferry, and they ferried boats over to Manhattan. And the only soldiers that didn't make it out were 3 soldiers who stayed after to loot through things. The last man on the boat was George Washington. He made it safely over to Manhattan, therefore saving his army, losing New York in the process, but in the end, he came out victorious. Now let's move again.